So in the previous lecture, we explained supply curve shift and demand curve shift simultaneously. So supply curve can have two possible shifts, left and right. Demand curve has two possible shifts, left and right. And a possible combination of all the shifts is 2 cross 2. There are 4 possible cases, and we have explained these 4 possible cases with diagrams. So our case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4, depending on which way supply and demand curve is shifting. So let's now actually delve a little deep into what will happen to price and quantity because of the shifts. And we'll see it depends on the relative shift. Okay. So let me explain each of this diagram. So let's say the first diagram. So in this case, we had our supply curve shifted to right and demand curve shifted to right. So when supply and demand both shifts to right, irrespective of to what extent which curve shifts, since both are shifting right, so quantity is going to increase. So there is no doubt about this. So we know the quantity is going to increase, and that is why I have written Q1 is greater than Q, no matter what. Now let's talk about the price. And we said price, we can't say anything about the price. And there is a reason why you can't say anything about the price based on the information, because we need to know the relative shift, okay? So let me actually explain case by case, okay? So let's say the supply curve has already shifted here. So I'll take one shift constant, it has already happened, and then I will see what happens if the other shift, let's say in this case demand, the relative shift of demand, in terms of the supply curve, and we will see what happens to the price. So let's say my supply shifted to right. So here supply shifts right, supply shifts right. Now if the demand curve, let's say I write small shift, I'll use this abbreviations because there is very little space here. So demand shift is small. So if the demand shift is small, so demand, you remember, demand is shifting to right. So demand shift is very small. So I'll just draw a line very close to the demand curve. So what will happen to the price? The price will actually, just looking at these 2 points, these 2 equilibriums, my price is going to go down, because you can make sense that the relative shift of demand as compared to the shift of supply is lower, right? So I have more quantity available in the market than the demand. So then the price is falling. The price will fall, okay? Whereas if the demand shift is much higher, if the demand shift is much higher, let me write down, the price is going to go down here. But if the demand shift is much higher, so instead of this line being here, let me draw something here, okay? So the demand shift is much higher, okay? So there is small change in supply. Supply has increased, but the demand has increased much more. So what will happen? People actually are requiring that product or services is in much higher quantity. So then what will happen? It intuitively makes sense. The price will increase, right? And that is exactly what you can see from the diagram. So the demand shift is larger. So larger, I say smaller because it's a relative quantity. I'm basically comparing with the shift of supply. So the price is going to go up, all right? Great. Now we'll keep the demand shift constant. Let's say I already have my new demand curve is here. My new demand curve is here. And let's say, so demand shifts, right? So I will now look at the supply shift, okay? And we'll of course see the relative changes, okay? We'll actually be able to make sense, intuitively, just looking at, just considering the relative changes. So if my demand shifts here, and I'll draw the supply shift with a different color. Let's say I will use this blue color, and supply, first let's say the supply has shifted very little. Now I have a lot of demand increased, but my supply increases little less, okay, relatively less. So of course the price will be higher. So supply smaller, so price is going to go up. Similarly, if I have a supply curve that shifts much right, let's say here, so what will happen? My new demand curve is here, my new supply curve is here. So in each previous equilibrium was here, my new equilibrium is here. So that means the price is falling, okay? So if the supply is higher, supply shift is higher, so then the price will fall. Okay, so it makes sense, right? Intuitively as well as graphically. Now similarly for the other diagram, we can also make sense. We can say that, let's say, in this case, we will following the same convention. in the both the supply and demand curve actually shifting left. Okay, so let's say I will take the supply shift left, supply shifts left. So I take this as already happened. Supply shifts left here. So this is my new supply curve. Now I'll look at the demand curve. Just like before, what I'll do, I will first look at a very small slight shift of the demand curve. Okay. So demand curve is already almost like the previous green line. So then what will happen? I will have my intersecting point here, okay, which is going to be above the previous equilibrium price, right? So if my supply has shifted to right and my demand has slightly shifted. So essentially, there's a lot of cut in supply, whereas the demand has still like higher, right? So the relative demand, actually, are considering the relative demand here. So then, because this demand shift is smaller, the price is actually going to go up, right? But on the other hand, if the demand shift was much higher, let's say the demand has come down to here, and my new supply line is here, supply curve is here, so essentially my new price is here. So I'll see my new price is actually much lower than the previous price. So if the demand shift is higher, my new price is actually going to go down. All right. Now, let's say that now I talk about the demand curve first. I will essentially shift the demand curve. Okay. So let's say I already have my demand shift left, demand shift left. The demand curve has shifted to left. Okay. Now, if the demand curve has shifted to left, and now I'll draw the supply curve. Okay. So now my new demand curve is here. My new demand curve is here, and my supply curve, this previous supply curve, is here. Now I will actually shift my supply curve in two quantities. One, I will shift it to a smaller quantity, which is here. So it means I will have my new equilibrium point is here. So my demand curve has already shifted quite a bit. Okay, quite a bit, a lot. Okay, whereas my supply shifted a little bit. Okay, so essentially there's a much less demand as compared to the supply, and then what will happen from the previous equilibrium, so new equilibrium price is going to be lower than the previous equilibrium point. So essentially, if the demand shift, if the supply shift is smaller, so then the price is going to go down. Price is going to go down. Whereas if my supply shift is higher, so what will happen if the supply shift is higher? If the supply shift is higher, the supply curve will come to here, let's say somewhere here. Okay, so very, very, like drastic cut in supply. So demand has fallen, supply has also fallen. So what will happen? But the relative fall of supply is much higher. So what will happen? So the relative fall of supply as compared to the relative fall of demand is much higher. So essentially the price will rise. So that actually intuitively makes sense. Even if we don't have a graph, we can actually make sense from the logics. Okay, so it makes sense to sort of explain how the prices will change depending on the relative shift of supply and demand curve. Now for the other two cases where we actually have seen that the prices are we can say things concretely about the price but not about the quantity, because the supply and demand curve is actually moving in the opposite directions. Okay, and I will explain one case, and the other case I will leave for you to actually sort of do it yourself. So let me actually explain the third case, okay, and the fourth case I will not explain. So the third case is going to be uh, I have high supply, and my demand. So basically, my supply is increasing and the demand is decreasing. Okay. So now let's say, just like before, let's say I will take my new supply line. So new supply line is here. So I will write down. So just like before, I'll write down supply shifts to right. Shifts to right. and you have to sort of look at the relative shift of the demand. So my new supply curve is here. My demand curve is initial demand curve is here. So if first I shift my demand curves a little bit, okay. So I have my, you know, I have increased my supply a lot. I have decreased my demand a little bit. So what will happen? I will get my new equilibrium point. And in this new equilibrium point, I see the quantity is still higher. Quantity is still going to be higher than my previous quantity. So if my previous Q was here, my new Q is going to be somewhere here. Okay, somewhere here. So my new Q, Q1 is actually, or Q prime is actually more than Q, previous Q. So I will write supply shifts right, demand, I will follow the same convention. So demand, I will write demand shift is smaller, demand shift smaller. So the quantity, this time we're not talking about price, we're talking about the quantity. Quantity is going to go high, okay? But if the demand shift is much higher, supply has increased, but as my demand has fallen drastically, okay? So let's say my demand curve is here now, all right? So even if the supply curve has moved to right, because my demand has fallen drastically, my new intersecting point is here, okay? So that means my quantity, let's say Q double prime, is actually much less than Q, okay? So demand is higher. So then my Q is going to go down, okay? On the other hand, I will now keep my demand curve fixed. So I will have my fixed demand curve. So this time my demand curve is going to be this one because I'm fixing it. So my demand curve is already shifted. So demand shifts to left. Okay, so this time demand shifts to left. Now when the demand shifts to left, so I have fixed this demand line and I'll see what happens to the supply line for the different changes. And I have, let's say, like previously, I have a supply line which is shifted to right, but in a very, very small quantity, okay, very, very small quantity. So my intersecting point is going to be this, okay. So it means the quantity, the previous quantity was here, but the new quantity is going to be less than that. Let's say Q triple prime, okay. So the new quantity is actually less than the equilibrium quantity, okay. So if demand shifts right, and supply shifts to smaller, supply shifts smaller, okay, smaller but right, okay. So directions are already defined here, so supply shifts to right. So then what will happen? The quantity is actually going to go down, whereas if the supply shifts drastically towards right, let's say here, okay, and my new demand curve is here, so then I will have a new quantity which is going to be much higher, okay. So supply curve, if it sort of higher shift, so then my q is going to go up, all right. And of course, for all the cases I have already explained that the price is going to be the uh, price is going to be less than the uh, initial price, okay. So with this we will end this lecture, and I'll leave the fourth case for you to sort of uh, get the possible explanations. So we end this lecture here, and thank you.